My name is Keith Luchtel. I was born in 1941, September 7th, in Spencer, Iowa, and grew up in Milford, Iowa. I have been in love with airplanes since as long as I can remember. And I had an uncle that was a Navy pilot, and occasionally would fly through the area, and that was my inspiration, I suppose. And I grew up by the small airport there and got to know the airport operator. And when I was in high school or at that age, I would go up there and wash airplanes and do whatever I could to try to get an hour or two of flying at some point. So I wanted to go to West Point originally, and then they built the Air Force Academy, so my goal shifted to the Air Force Academy, and that's where I went to college. I really don't have a memory of knowing much about Vietnam before I went to the Academy. So I went to the Academy in June of 1960, and so I don't think we really had much of a presence there at that time. When I was at the Academy, however, and towards graduation, some of my classmates were very concerned that the war would be over before we had an opportunity to perform our wondrous activities that we were capable of doing. We were sure we were going to be able to save the free world. Well, I was really torn because I had an opportunity to go two different routes. Could have gone into fighters, and I went instead into C-130s. And my thought was that in C-130s I would see the world, and I had some familiarity with some special operations that were done with C-130s, and so I thought that was very attractive, very adventuresome, and so I chose a C-130. So we graduated in '64, and I went right to pilot training, and from there, I think I first hit Vietnam in like January of '66. Okay. We did do special operations kinds of things out of that unit, and another unit that I was in later, and so those would involve classified kind of operations, and they would involve maybe taking somebody somewhere or picking up somebody somewhere or dropping some cargo somewhere, something along those lines. Well, I was young and dumb enough to do it, I suppose, and that, but we would usually be pretty well briefed on, depending on what the operation was. If it was simply, you know, might be something you'd just be briefed in a day or two beforehand and then plan it out, but some of them might take months of training and special preparation. My wife saved my life in a sense that she picked the wedding date that she picked, because we were I was training up at that time for a special operation that was not successful, and as I got closer to actually going, when I got closer and closer to my wedding date, and I finally went to the commander and I said, you know, if the people in Washington don't make up their mind, I got a conflict because you know, I got this wedding plan for June 4th. So finally he said, okay, well, and we always did have on a big operation, you'd have somebody trained up to kind of be a substitute in case you broke a leg or something. But so my replacement then was moved in, and I left the operation, and they were all lost the weekend before my wedding. So had I not had a wedding, I would have been among them. Well, I'd been in Vietnam with the C-130 several times, and then after a certain point, I was given orders to become what they call a forward air controller, a FAC. And so I went down to Eglin Air Force Base, or Hurlburt Field in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and trained to fly the 01 airplane, which is also known in the Army as an L-19, which is a single-engine Cessna-like plane, two-seater, tandem seating, and trained to control airstrikes and do reconnaissance work, and then deployed to Vietnam after, I don't know, 2 or 3 months training there in Fort Walton Beach. Our job would be to coordinate strike missions and then direct strike missions from our light airplanes. So, and then it would be your responsibility as a forward air controller then to take control of the fighter elements as they would come in, and then kind of be their air traffic controller, if you will, and direct them onto the target with a stationary target. But if you had troops in contact, then it was you know, all out. That was no holding back, and you went full bore to help the guys on the ground. And so typically that would be well, it might be covering a helicopter insertion of ground troops, in which helicopters would bring them in, and we would be providing cover for that whole operation. We might just be having fighters in orbit, so that if they encountered contact early on in their insertion, why then we'd be able to help them out with air support. The troops in contact were the most difficult, in the sense that if you had, and there were times where you'd have a unit in disarray, they'd been ambushed or somehow gotten, you know, spread out, or weren't organized, and they needed help, and sometimes in desperate circumstances, and you would be responsible for trying to help them get organized, and then you had to learn where they were through either panels that they would lay out on the ground, or if you had to, you'd have them do smoke grenades so you could locate them. There were a couple of times where they would be almost on top of one another, and you'd try to do what you could to give them separation, or get them separation, give them the opportunity to separate. Mm-hmm. And so that was those were the high risk missions, and they knew it and we knew it, and so you did, you know, the best you could to help them out without hurting anybody. I think I lived on like $40 a month in Vietnam, because I couldn't buy a drink or a meal because the Army guys would treat us very well. I got there after Tet had ended, in the sense that I think the early part of the Tet offensive had finished, and I got there like first part of April of 1968. It was, you know, high risk, and a high loss rate kind of environment, and you kind of learned that, you know, war is a lot of luck. There's a lot of luck involved in that, and so you did what you could to minimize your risk, but you knew there was always risk. Mm-hmm. A good friend who was British, and his family were in Scotland, and they were very pro-American, and they wanted to have an American flag flown in combat in Vietnam. So I got the flag from him early in June, and I thought, well, gee, the Flag Day is coming up in a few days. I'll just stick that in my flight suit on the 14th, and when I fly. And I almost made it back to the Special Forces camp, and so I knew I was, you know, that the airplane had taken a round in the engine, so I knew I was, it was a matter of whether I could stretch the thing out long enough to get back. And so I was, when I crashed, I actually just kind of crash landed it, not too far away, so I was picked up almost, you know, immediately, and some Army guys in a personnel carrier or something showed up, and there I was cut up a little bit, and, you know, had blood on the flight suit and so on, and the pocket that I had stuck the flag in was right on this lower right leg, and that got cut up, and so I sent the flag back to him, and I said it had indeed flown in Vietnam, and the blood's mine. Some of the things that were most significant in my contribution to the effort, I think, were things that I didn't do. One of which was an order that I received while in the air. They gave me coordinates, and they said, you know, this was a high value target, act on it immediately, and they had intelligence that some North Vietnamese command group was meeting here, and that was not an unusual target assignment. It was unusual if it amounted to anything, but so anyway, I went to the coordinates, and it was this little village, and I'd flown over that village many times, and I knew, where everything ought to be and what the activity ought to be, and everything looked very normal to me, and the same wash lady waved to me like she always does, and so I radioed back in, and I said, well, would you check the coordinates? That doesn't seem to me to be a valid target assignment. And so the fellow on the radio said, stand by, and they read them back to me, the same target area. And I said, well, I'm not accepting the order. And the guy says, what do you mean you're not accepting the order? And I said, well, it's not a valid military target. There is no military target there, and I refuse to execute on it. So somebody else gets on the radio, and they say, what do you mean you aren't going to bomb the target? And I said, well, it's not a valid target. It's a village, and there's normal activity, and I'm familiar with the village. And they said, well, that's the target coordinates. You will bomb the target. And I said, no, I refuse the order. It's not a lawful order. And so the guy says, well, stand by. And some colonel gets on the radio and says, are you refusing to bomb that target? And I said, yes, sir, I am. It's not a valid target. And he said, you bomb that target or you'll be in Leavenworth by tomorrow night. I said, sir, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to bomb the target, sir. And there was silence for a minute, and all of a sudden, the first guy comes back on the radio. He says, sir, stand by for a correction on those coordinates. They had reversed them. I was just flying from one place to another, and I got a call for help from some of my Special Forces friends that I knew, and they had been ambushed by a pretty large force. And so I don't know how many fighters I put in on that target, how many flights of fighters, but several, to get them extracted from their problem. And as we were finishing the day's activities, why I asked them, I said, has everybody been picked up? Is everybody accounted for? And they said, radioed back that they were missing 2 people, but go ahead and just generally bomb the area. And I said, well, wait a minute, what, are they dead or what's their status? And they said, well, we don't really know. We're missing a lieutenant and a major. And I said, well, I'm not going to bomb out there if I don't know where those guys are. And they said, well, I'm sure they're dead, But I said, well, has anybody, seen their bodies or seen what happened to them? Well, nobody had. And I said, well, I'm not going to bomb that area until I know. And you guys are extracted now, so we'll get you out of there, and then we'll bring another unit in the morning and see if we can find anything of those 2, get the remains. And so we came in the morning where they found the lieutenant in a bunker. He'd had a leg wound, and they had bandaged his leg wound, put medication on the wound to fight infection, and made him comfortable and gave him something to eat and left, and some water. Left some water with him and left. And the major, he told me, was still alive and mobile, and he said they walked him out with them, walked him into Cambodia, which wasn't too far away. And so when the POWs returned, he was one of the POWs. He lives in Wisconsin. When they talk about the high value target to us was anytime you had American troops in contact. So we were dedicated to doing whatever we could to help the Army guys on the ground. And so there was a time when I came upon an outfit that had been ambushed. This young enlisted man was stuck with, had no NCOs, no officers left, and the task was to get him settled down. And he was in, like any of us would be, he was pretty much in a panic mode, and he was not, they were all kind of dispersed, and so I had to get him to calm down and get his people to get together and set up a line, and so we could give them air support and then eventually get helicopters in to get them out, which he was able to do. He pulled it together and we got her done. One of the risks of being a forward air controller was a risk of assassination, in that there were rewards offered for forward air controllers, and they had ways of determining who we were and where we lived. I never went anywhere without at least 2 guns. Some of the guys that were remote areas had especially had problems in that regard. They might be ambushed on a street, or somebody would make a run at you, and so we were always prepared. In that I actually flew the last part of my tour with back problems, and sitting in the seat after some period of time, my legs would go numb. So I was flying by pushing on my knees to run the rudder pedals, and then when I got finished with that, when I got back to the States, a colonel, I think, saw me having to get help to get out of a cockpit, and he said, well, what's that all about? So a trip to the flight surgeon, and my flying days, they didn't ground me immediately, but they said I wouldn't pass my next flight physical.